Hello, our guest is Thomas de Waal, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Foundation. Thank you for joining us, Tom. So you have been studying the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict for many years. From your perspective, can we really say that peace has now been established as leaders in Yerevan, Baku and Washington claim?
Not yet, I think is the answer. Peace is certainly achievable, and I think more achievable thanks to the meeting in Washington, which I think had symbolic importance, if not anything else. But obviously, there are many steps to go before there will be a peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and also between Armenia and Turkey, which was not mentioned in Washington. And of course, this is a region which knows political turbulence, political instability. Armenia faces elections next year. So peace, I think, is visible, but a lot more work needs to be done.
By signing this agreement, is the United States actually providing any kind of security guarantees? President Trump even said, if you face problems, call me.
Sure. Well, I think that is the guarantee there that this new road route through Sunik Zangezur will bear the personal name of Trump. I think that is a deliberate ploy by both sides to say that this person, Donald Trump, is personally invested in this route. But let's take a step back a little and sort of try to understand what's going on here. Obviously, both sides have been negotiating for a long time, not only about the text of a peace agreement, which was the text is agreed, but as we know, Azerbaijan still has one important element it wants to see, which is the change of the Armenian constitution. And they've also been negotiating about this route through Sunik. Since 2021, this has basically been, if there's been a negotiator, it's mainly been Russia, thanks to the Trilateral Government Commission. And of course, there was the November 2020 ceasefire statement, which said in Article 9 that the Russian FSB will guard this route to Nakhchivan. I think what's changed in the last few months, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 months, is that both sides agreed that they wanted to reject the Russian plan, the Russian mediation and Russian security offer. And we see, for different reasons, both sides, Armenia and Azerbaijan, both quarreling with Russia in the last few months, and neither wanting a Russian-dominated, a Russian-controlled route. So this is obviously what they discussed in their bilateral meeting in Abu Dhabi in July, and this, I think, accelerated the intervention of the Trump administration. In a sense, Trump, I think, got lucky. Both sides wanted a new guarantor of this route, which was not Russia, and which looked powerful enough for the Russians and also the Iranians to respect this route. And this is what we got with the agreement in Washington. And so this is obviously a big step forward, but there are many unanswered questions here, which we can discuss. Two to name just, but two. One, what are the details of this agreement? Issue here for Armenia is the opening of the Armenia-Turkey border. Both those big questions, I think, are still unanswered.
Yes, there are concerns that Azerbaijan would gain a corridor, while Armenians would still not be able to move freely across Azerbaijani territory. So would you call this unblocking?
Well, as I say, it's a bit too early to say. I think it's positive the Americans are involved. The Americans have power, influence, finance, and for this to work for Armenia, it needs to be more than one road, as you've already hinted. It needs to involve Armenian access through Azerbaijani territory to, to other countries. So, and I think the financing question here is very important. I think it will be difficult to get big international financing for just one road through Sunik. The international interest grows if it's part of a bigger route, which begins in Kars, goes to Gumri, Yerask, Nakhchivan, down to Megri, across to Azerbaijan. Then it suddenly becomes an international route. This is what Armenia wants, and I think this would attract international finance. Again, we don't really have an answer to that question.
Do you see any signs from Turkish side to make a step to open the border, taking into consideration that Washington is involved in the process?
Well, it would be logical. Turkey, I think, has major interests in this becoming an international route of using what they call the Zangezur corridor. They say they want to construct a new railway between Kars and Idi to Igdir to Nakhchivan, but that will take many years. It would actually be much quicker just to rebuild two smaller sections of railway and road from Kars to Gumri and from Sadarak to Yerask in connecting Armenia and the north side of Nakhchivan. That would be much quicker. And so I think it was an obvious absence here that there was no mention of Turkey in the Washington meeting. And here we have to understand, I think, what are relations between Washington and Ankara. We know that Trump and Erdogan had quite a good relationship during Trump's first term, but we know there are a lot of problems still outstanding between the US and Ankara over Syria, over Gaza, and so on. So I think it is to be hoped that Washington and Ankara now talk much more closely about widening this Armenia-Azerbaijan deal. And of course, the Europeans have been working a lot about this. The Europeans don't get much credit, but they've actually been doing a lot of hard work on these issues already, and are already involved in that conversation.
And Russia is obviously not happy about this process. Do you predict any kind of pressure on Armenia?
Well, I think Russia is obviously not happy because they've lost their struggle to get the FSB to guard this corridor. Having said that, the Russian official reaction has been fairly muted, not very strong. I think Russia also understands that if this route opens, okay, maybe Russia will not control the security of it, but this is obviously a positive for Russia as well. It becomes a new link in its north-south corridor to Iran. So I think Russia has an interest in no Western security presence in this corridor. And I think the Armenians are also not talking about a Western security presence here. Maybe there would be some private firm involved. So maybe the Russians, although they'd be disappointed with this deal, could still live with it in the future.
One of the main preconditions for signing the peace treaty, as you already have mentioned, is changing Armenia's constitutions. How can this be achieved? I mean, in Armenia, this will be difficult if the referendum does not get enough votes. President Aliyev could easily say, so this is revenge.
Sure. I mean, I think this is a difficult issue. And I think the more Azerbaijan talks about this issue, the more difficult it is for an Armenian leader to get a change of the constitution. I think if it's done at the same time as an election next year, then hopefully you'll get a high turnout. Hopefully Azerbaijan will keep quiet about this. And, I think many people say that Armenia does need changes to its constitution. And hopefully this would just be one element amongst many changes in the constitution. And in that context, it might be easier to get it passed. But for sure, nothing is guaranteed. We know that Prime Minister Pashinyan, his party, their popularity is falling. We know that Armenian opposition and Russian support for that opposition is also, a key factor, and they will probably try to use this constitution issue to block Pashinyan and therefore block a peace treaty. I think that's quite a likely scenario. Yes.
Another issue is border delimitation and the question of Armenia's occupied territories. Will Azerbaijan really withdraw so easily according to the map?
Again, this is a very difficult issue. I think some people were surprised that nothing was said in the Washington documents either about the Azerbaijani president's presence on the border territories near Jamuk, and also nothing was said about Armenian detainees. So that was a negative for Armenia. I think many Armenians hoped that there would be some detainees would be freed after the Washington meeting, for example. But I think the best thing to be said here is that if there is general progress in Armenia-Azerbaijan relations, these issues become easier. I think the most important thing about that meeting was President Aliyev signing a statement which contradicts really a lot of his own rhetoric and narrative the last few years. A statement which talked about Armenia as a partner, talked about facing the future, talked about not avoiding the politics of revenge. This is very different kind of language from what we've heard from the Azerbaijani leader, who seems to be still, in his speeches at least, still fighting the conflict with Armenia. So if the language changes from Aliyev, and he's already committed himself to that in the presence of Donald Trump, that is a significant change which will make other issues like Armenian detainees or the Azerbaijanis in Jamuk region easier to solve, I think.
Tom, do you agree that the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is a closed chapter, as Prime Minister Pashinyan claims?
It is a closed chapter, I think, and this is obviously kind of bitter news for the Karabakhi Armenians who fled Karabakh. But I think most of them realize that there's very small chance of them returning to their homeland anytime soon. So again, that chapter is closed. Karabakh is basically empty of Armenians. It's very, very difficult to see how that will change. And again, I think will take a lot of change in Armenia-Azerbaijani relations for people to go back. So yeah, I would agree that chapter really is closed.
Yes, but on the other hand, still the fate of 120,000 people remains uncertain. I mean, they haven't disappeared, they still have rights. So how do you see this unresolved issue?
Sure, well, but I mean, we should say that they join the ranks of many other displaced people in this conflict. For example, the Armenians of Baku, Sumgait, Kirovabad, Ganja, as it is now called, they've also been displaced for many years. And I think for me personally, it's sad that the OSCE peace agreements, draft peace agreements, the Madrid principles, they always talked about the right of return of everyone displaced by this conflict. For me, that was an important element, and that's now disappeared from the language that we're seeing, and for me that's very, very unfortunate. I guess all we can hope for is that if there is peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, for a long period, and we're talking about many years, then people will feel secure enough to go back. But I doubt that I would be very surprised, unfortunately, if we see Armenians living in their former homes, anytime soon for many years.
And finally, the OSCE Minsk group has already been dissolved, but could it still have had a role, for instance, in addressing the rights of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh?
I think the Minsk group was designed to deal with the Karabakh conflict. It had a unique configuration with Russia and the West working together. So I think, you know, the war of 2020, the Armenian capture of, the Azerbaijani capture of Karabakh in 2023, and also the Ukraine war, they already basically killed the Minsk group. There was no way that it could really function. And so, yeah, I think the dissolution of the Minsk group acknowledges something that had really basically already happened.
Thank you, Tom, once again for this opportunity, and just let me remind that our guest was Thomas de Waal, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Foundation.
Thank you, Colin.